what does it mean for languages to be related, and how can that help you as a language learner? Now, to answer this question, we need to talk about language change. So a lot of people feel uncomfortable with the idea that languages change, but it's really just a fact of how languages work. When they're used, they change. We can see this in our own time. We've got a lot of new words related to social media and computers, whereas a lot of terms for the parts of a carriage and different terms like relating to heraldry and falconry have fallen out of use in the language. We also see change in every level of a language. We see sounds changing, grammar changing, words changing, word meanings changing. It's just fundamental about how languages work. Now the thing is, if you have a community that's using the language, often those language changes are fairly slow and don't really make any big impact on communication because everybody encounters those new changes as they're introduced. The thing is, as soon as you get some sort of division of a language community, those language changes start to take those different communities in different directions. So this could be a social division, such as you've got like a class distinction where people in certain classes don't talk to people in other classes. It can be a geographical distinction, some people move across a mountain range or across a river or across an ocean. Really, at any type of division, each community keeps changing, but the changes are different in each community. And at first, those changes won't cause any significant impact to understanding, but over time, those changes start to add up. And you start to notice, people from that side of the mountain range have a different accent or different dialect. Or eventually, you get enough changes adding up to where it's really different languages and people have trouble understanding each other. Incidentally, this division of what's a different dialect versus what's a different language can be kind of fuzzy. The just kind of rule of thumb that linguists like to use is called mutual intelligibility. If two people or two communities can understand each other, like if I'm speaking one language and you're speaking it, or one language variety and you're speaking another language variety, if we can both understand each other, then linguists would tend to call those the same language. Whereas if we have trouble understanding each other, then we'd be inclined to call those different languages. That's kind of a separate issue, though. Those language changes add up to create different languages. So we can see this, for instance, around the Mediterranean. So you go back, rewind the clock 2,000 years, and you see the Roman Empire around most of the Mediterranean. And Latin was spoken all throughout that area. But when the Roman Empire collapsed, we started getting the Latin from different places moving in different directions because people from Italy weren't necessarily talking to people in Spain as much. Without the protection of the Roman Empire, there was a lot less communication between different areas. And so you had the Gaulish Latin, or what's modern day France, kind of moved in one direction, whereas Italian Latin moved in a different direction, versus like Spanish Latin moved in a different direction. And those changes added up to where nowadays those are all different languages. We've got French and Italian and Spanish. They all started off roughly as Latin and were pretty similar at the beginning. But now they're different languages because we just had a lot of little changes that have added up over hundreds of years. The branch of linguistics that looks at language change is called historical linguistics. It's not really about the history of linguistics, it's really about studying the history of languages. So when we find two languages that share a common ancestor, like Italian and Spanish both came from Latin, we call those languages related, and we say that they're in a language family. So what we just have been talking about is the Romance language family, the different languages that are descendant from Latin. And there's a number of others as well. But we can keep rewinding the clock further. So what linguists like to do is we look at the languages spoken today, and we use those clues to figure out kind of the history of those languages. Now, in the case of Latin, it's really great because we have written records throughout most of the history, and so we can get a pretty good idea of what was happening historically. But even if we lost all those written records, we could make a pretty good guess by looking at Italian and Spanish that they're much too similar to have just been chance, to have just been similar by chance. our best understanding would be that those were one language in the past and that we had a number of different language changes that took those varieties in different directions. So we can do the same thing everywhere in the world. We can look at languages and we can find similarities between languages that let us deduce the history of those languages and deduce that maybe those languages were just one language in the past. Or another way to put that is that those languages are in the same language family. So in Europe, we can rewind the clock further. We can also look at, so we've rewound to Latin. We found that Latin and Greek were also are in a language family that includes Greek as well as all the Romance languages, like the Germanic languages, which includes German and Icelandic and Swedish, and even English is a part of the Germanic language family. Those languages are related in the Germanic language family. We can keep rewinding the clock when we find that the Germanic languages and the Romance languages and Greek and really just about all the languages spoken in Europe are part of just one language family called the Indo-European language family. You might ask, okay, I get European, why Indo? Well, turns out that a lot of the languages in India are actually part of the same language family. You can look at Hindi and Sanskrit, and they share a lot of similarities with the languages of Europe. And so we've got this big language family that includes languages in India as well as languages in Europe. And we can look at other places around the world and find other language families. So for instance, if we look at the Pacific Islands, we find that a lot of islands in the Pacific, especially in kind of remoter parts of the Pacific, are part of the Austronesian language family, which spreads across from Taiwan, Indonesia, including Indonesian, the Philippines, including the Philippine languages, across the kind of more coastal parts of Papua New Guinea, and all the way out to Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. Those languages are all a part of the Austronesian language family. We can do the same thing looking at other languages and other language families. Okay, so how can this help you as a language learner? So if you look at a particular language, if you're trying to learn a particular language, if you hear that it's part of a certain language family, or if it's related to a language that you know, this can really help you. So what we find is that when languages change, the language changes are overwhelmingly regular. So this can really help you as a language learner, because if you know that language changes are regular, they're going to leave patterns in the language. So one pattern that might help you is, for instance, in Portuguese and Spanish, they're both Romance languages, they're both related. There's a correspondence where we write an H in Spanish generally corresponds to an F in Portuguese. If you know one of those languages and you're learning the other, this can really help you. Now, if the languages are closely related, it's likely that these patterns are going to be easier to find. Where you might see, a T and an S, or a F and a P, or sounds that are more similar to each other, corresponding to each other. But if you look at more distantly related languages, some of the patterns might not stick out as much, but if you look for them, they'll be there. So you can kind of implement this in a couple different ways. The first thing I would encourage you to do is that if you're learning a language that's related to a language that you already know, so if you're an English speaker, if you're learning basically any of the languages that originated in Europe or any of the languages in northern India, keep an eye out for those because there probably are some similarities. Some of those might be obvious, but there might also be some similarities that are less obvious. So keep an eye out for those because they can really help you. If you're learning a language from a larger language family that has been studied, you can also do some research online and just figure out what those patterns are. Learn a little bit about what sounds in which language correspond to which sounds in another language and start to use that in your language learning. You can also look up what's called cognates, which is basically just the same word that's developed different ways in different languages. And look for lists of cognates, and that can really help you in kind of getting a jump start in learning a language. If you already know a bunch of languages, for instance, there's a book that I've used for learning to read French, and it's a kind of interesting approach where the first thing it does, before it really teaches you just about anything else about French, is it teaches you a few patterns to recognize similar words in French and English. So for instance, ES in English usually corresponds to E with a little hat on it in French. Teaches you a couple rules like that, and then just gives you a couple hundred words that are essentially the same or very similar in English and French, so that on your first week of learning French, you already know a couple hundred words. And this works for a lot of other languages. So if you are learning a language that's related to one that you know, see if you can start to look for those patterns, whether that's just identifying them as you encounter them or doing some extra digging online. Look for those patterns and start to use them to jumpstart your language learning.